My mother-in-law told everyone I had an abortion, on purpose, after losing my baby at 20 weeks. She poisoned my entire family against me during the worst moment of my life. But what I discovered about her past is so devastating it will leave you speechless. But before I tell you, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we tell here. Thank you for being part of our community. For you, it may be just a click, but for us, it's the fuel we need to keep finding and sharing these incredible stories. Now, let me tell you from the beginning. Hi, I'm Chloe, 42, and I've been a registered nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago for almost 15 years. I work in the neonatal intensive care unit, which means I've held more small hands than I can count. Some that grow stronger, others that are lost despite our best efforts. I thought I understood loss professionally, but nothing prepared me for what would happen when it became personal. My husband, Miguel, and I had been trying to conceive for 4 years, suffering 2 early miscarriages and countless negative pregnancy tests that felt like small deaths each month. When we finally saw those 2 pink lines in March 2023, we were cautiously optimistic, afraid to celebrate too loudly after previous disappointments. The first 5 months felt like a miracle unfolding in slow motion. Morning sickness that I welcomed because it meant everything was progressing normally. The first ultrasound at 8 weeks showing a tiny heartbeat that made Miguel cry. The anatomy scan at 16 weeks revealing we were having a son, and Miguel immediately started calling him Mijo and playing mariachi music to my belly every night. We painted the nursery a soft blue, assembled the crib together on a Saturday afternoon in July, and I caught Miguel more than once just standing in the doorway, imagining the future we were building. Those months were the happiest of our 8-year marriage, filled with plans and dreams and the kind of hope that makes everything else in life feel secondary. We told our families at 12 weeks, and even my usually reserved mother-in-law Patricia seemed genuinely happy, knitting tiny blankets and talking about becoming abuela for the first time. At 21 weeks, during what should have been a routine checkup, our world imploded. The ultrasound technician's face changed from routine concentration to concerned confusion as she moved the wand across my belly. She called in Dr. Rodriguez, my obstetrician, who studied the images with increasing gravity before sitting down to deliver news that rewrote our future in the cruelest way possible. Our baby had anencephaly, a neural tube defect where the brain and skull failed to develop properly. She showed us the images, our son's beautiful profile, his perfect little hands, and the devastating absence where his brain should have been. The condition was incompatible with life. If he survived to term, he might live for minutes or hours, but he would never be conscious, never recognize us, never experience anything but reflexive responses to pain. Dr. Rodriguez explained our options with gentle professionalism, but really, there was only one choice that made sense to us as parents who loved this baby desperately. We could continue the pregnancy knowing our son would die, experiencing unknown levels of suffering in his brief life, or we could end the pregnancy and spare him that pain. The decision felt like choosing between 2 different kinds of hell, but Miguel and I both knew immediately what we had to do. We couldn't bear the thought of our son suffering for our need to hold him, even briefly. That night, we lay in bed holding each other and sobbing for the future that would never be. No first steps, no bedtime stories, no teaching him to ride a bike or play baseball. We were losing not just our baby, but all the dreams we'd built around him. We scheduled the procedure for the following week, giving ourselves time to say goodbye to the child we'd never meet. Miguel took time off work, and we spent those days talking to my belly, telling our son how much we loved him, how we wished things could be different, how this choice came from love, not from lack of it. We decided to tell our families that I'd had a late miscarriage due to fetal abnormalities, thinking it would be easier than explaining the medical complexities and the impossible choice we'd made. Looking back, that decision to simplify the truth became the ammunition my mother-in-law would use to destroy me. But in that moment, drowning in our own grief, We just wanted to protect ourselves from having to explain over and over why we'd made the hardest decision of our lives. The day of the procedure was the longest of my life. The medical team at the hospital where I worked was compassionate and professional, treating us not as another case but as grieving parents making an impossible choice out of love. I remember the anesthesiologist holding my hand as I went under, whispering that our baby would never feel pain, never know anything but the warmth and safety of my womb. When I woke up, the physical emptiness was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the emotional void that followed. Miguel held me as I cried, and we named our son Diego after Miguel's grandfather, giving him an identity, even though we'd never see him grow into it. The grief counselor at the hospital told us that this was still a birth, still a loss, still a death that deserved to be mourned properly. We held a small memorial service at our church, St. Adalbert's, 3 days later. Father Martinez, who'd married us 5 years earlier, led a beautiful ceremony acknowledging Diego's brief life and our profound loss. Most of our extended family attended, offering the kind of support that helps you survive the impossible. My parents were devastated but wrapped us in unconditional love, never questioning our choices, only grieving with us for their grandson they'd never meet. But even then, I noticed something cold in Patricia's demeanor, a distance that felt more like judgment than grief. She sat in the back during the service, barely spoke to anyone, and left immediately afterward without the traditional gathering of family. Miguel noticed too, but we were both too consumed by our own pain to really process what her behavior might mean for our future. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came 6 weeks after Diego's memorial service, during my first day back at work. I'd taken extended bereavement leave, something the hospital encouraged for staff members dealing with pregnancy loss, especially those of us working in maternal care. Returning to the NICU was emotionally brutal. Every tiny baby I cared for reminded me of what I'd lost. Every set of new parents I congratulated felt like swallowing broken glass. But I wasn't prepared for the way some of my colleagues looked at me that first day back. There were sidelong glances, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, and a general discomfort that had nothing to do with normal grief acknowledgement. Sandra Martinez, a fellow nurse who'd been a close friend for years, finally pulled me aside during lunch break. "Chloe, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say this gently," Sandra said, her voice filled with anger and sadness. "There are rumors going around the community about what happened to your baby. Someone's been saying that you didn't actually have a miscarriage, that you chose to terminate a healthy pregnancy because you weren't ready to be a mother." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. Sandra continued, "I know it's not true, but the story is spreading through the Latino community, and some people here have heard it too. They're saying you used your medical knowledge to hide an elective abortion behind the story of fetal abnormalities." I couldn't speak for several minutes, my mind reeling with the implications of what someone was doing to my reputation and my grief. That evening, I confronted Miguel about what Sandra had told me. His reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of immediate outrage and support, I saw something that terrified me more than the rumors themselves. Doubt, just a flicker, just a moment of hesitation, but it was there in his eyes before he caught himself. "That's ridiculous, Chloe," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Who would say something like that about you? About us?" When I asked if he'd heard anything similar, he admitted that a few guys at the construction site had made comments, asking why we'd been so quick to give up on our baby, why we hadn't sought second opinions or specialists. The poison was already working, and I could see it spreading through my own marriage like an infection. Over the following weeks, the isolation became more pronounced and more painful. At the grocery store in our Pilsen neighborhood, Mrs. Gonzalez, who'd known me since Miguel and I started dating, crossed herself when she saw me and quickly looked away. At the bank, the teller who usually chatted about her own children became coldly professional. At church, the whispers followed me down the aisles like shadows. and I found myself sitting alone in pews where families used to welcome me warmly. The community that had supported me through my previous miscarriages was now treating me like I was contagious with something far worse than grief. I was carrying a scarlet letter I'd never earned, branded with choices I'd never made, judged for sins I'd committed only in someone else's twisted imagination. The worst part was watching Miguel's faith in me erode day by day. He started asking questions that broke my heart. Why had I been so certain about the diagnosis? Why hadn't I wanted to get a second opinion? Why had I seemed relieved after the procedure? Each question felt like a betrayal, evidence that the lies were taking root even in the mind of the man who'd held me while I cried for our lost son. He began working longer hours, coming home exhausted and distant, sleeping in the guest room more often than in our bed. When I tried to initiate conversations about what was happening to us, he'd shut down, claiming he was processing and needed space. The woman spreading these lies wasn't just destroying my reputation, she was systematically dismantling my marriage and my support system during the darkest period of my life. The identity of my tormentor became clear when Isabella Ruiz, a family friend who worked at the community center, called me in tears one October evening. "Chloe, I can't stay quiet anymore," she sobbed into the phone. "It's Patricia. She's been coming to the center every week, telling anyone who will listen that you manipulated Miguel into believing you had a miscarriage when you really chose to kill your baby because you weren't ready to sacrifice your career. She's saying you used your nursing knowledge to fake medical reports and convince Miguel you had no choice." The revelation was devastating but not surprising. I'd suspected my mother-in-law from the beginning, but hearing it confirmed felt like being gutted all over again. Isabella continued through her tears. "She's not just telling random people, Chloe. She's targeting the church ladies, the school parents, anyone connected to your family or Miguel's work. She's painting herself as the grieving grandmother who lost her first grandchild to your selfishness. People believe her because she seems so heartbroken, so sincere. And because you're not defending yourself, some people think your silence is proof of guilt." I hung up the phone and sat in my empty nursery, surrounded by the crib we'd built with such hope and the tiny clothes we'd bought with such love. And I realized that Patricia wasn't just spreading lies about me. She was weaponizing my grief, using my own reluctance to relive the most painful details of our loss as evidence of my guilt. It was a level of cruelty I hadn't thought possible from someone I'd considered family. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October, when Miguel finally voiced the questions that had been eating at him for weeks. I was making dinner when he came home from work, his face showing the strain of carrying doubts he could no longer bear alone. "Chloe, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, sitting heavily at our kitchen table. The weight in his voice told me this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be an interrogation. "Is there any possibility that the doctors were wrong about Diego? Any chance that you pushed for the termination because you were scared of being a mother?" The questions hit me like physical blows, each one evidence of how thoroughly Patricia's poison had infiltrated his mind. "Miguel, how can you ask me that?" I whispered, turning off the stove because my hands were shaking too badly to continue cooking. "You were there for every appointment. You saw the ultrasound images. You held me while I cried for our son." But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way Patricia's lies had taken root and grown into something that looked like truth to him. He pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots of text messages from his mother, detailed accusations about my suspicious behavior, my eagerness to end the pregnancy, my cold reaction to the diagnosis. Each message was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting me as a calculating monster who'd fooled everyone, including my own husband. "Atu, she says you never even cried at the doctor's office," Miguel said, reading from his phone. "She says you were too calm, too accepting of the diagnosis, like you'd been planning this all along." The accusation was so far from reality that it would have been laughable if it wasn't destroying my marriage. I had cried so hard at that appointment that Dr. Rodriguez had given me sedatives. I'd been devastated, not calm. But Patricia was rewriting history, creating a narrative where my professional medical knowledge became evidence of premeditation rather than understanding. I realized then that this wasn't just about grief or misunderstanding. This was a calculated campaign designed to destroy me, and my own husband was becoming her unwitting weapon. "Miguel, listen to yourself," I pleaded, moving closer to him. "You think I wanted to lose our baby? You think I planned to go through the trauma of a late-term termination for fun? You think I enjoyed every minute of agony we went through together?" But I could see that logic was losing the battle against months of psychological manipulation. Patricia had been working on him systematically, planting seeds of doubt during family dinners, watering them with carefully crafted lies, and nurturing them with false concern for his well-being. She'd positioned herself as the only person who truly understood his pain, the only one brave enough to tell him the truth about his wife's deception. That night, Miguel slept in the guest room, and I knew our marriage was hanging by a thread. I called in sick to work the next day and spent hours going through our medical records, printing every document that proved the reality of Diego's condition and our impossible choice. But as I assembled the evidence, I realized that facts weren't going to be enough to combat Patricia's emotional manipulation. She'd created a narrative where my medical knowledge made me more suspicious, not more credible. Every piece of evidence I presented could be twisted into proof of my elaborate deception. I needed something more powerful than facts. I needed to understand why Patricia was doing this to us, what motivated such calculated cruelty. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carmen Herrera, Patricia's older sister who lived in Aurora, called me on a Friday afternoon in early November. "Chloe, mija, we need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice heavy with something that sounded like guilt and determination mixed together. "What Patricia is doing to you is wrong, and I think I know why she's doing it. But we need to meet in person, somewhere private where no one from the family will see us." We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Oak Park, neutral territory where neither of our communities would recognize us. As I drove to meet Carmen, I felt a mixture of hope and dread, sensing that whatever she had to tell me would change everything. Carmen was already seated when I arrived, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her eyes showing the strain of carrying secrets she was finally ready to share. She stood to embrace me, holding on longer than usual, as if she was trying to transfer some strength or comfort through the contact. "Chloe, I'm so sorry for what happened to your baby, and I'm even more sorry for what my sister has been doing to you since," she whispered. "Patricia isn't just spreading lies out of grief or confusion. She's projecting her own guilt and shame onto you, and it's time someone told you the truth about why." As we sat down across from each other, Carmen looked around nervously before leaning forward to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "But there's something about Patricia that almost no one in the family knows," Carmen began, her voice trembling with the weight of secrets kept too long. "Something that happened a long time ago, before she married Carlos, before Miguel was born. Something that explains why she's so desperate to punish you for choices that remind her of her own past." She paused, gathering courage for what came next, and I could see decades of family loyalty warring with moral obligation in her expression. In 1979, when Patricia was 19 years old and dating Carlos, she got pregnant. But instead of rushing into marriage like everyone believes, she made a choice that she's been hiding and feeling guilty about for over 40 years. She had an abortion, Chloe. A healthy baby that she terminated because she wasn't ready to be a mother and wanted to finish community college first. The revelation hit me like lightning, illuminating everything that had seemed inexplicable about Patricia's behavior. The woman who'd been calling me a murderer, who'd been spreading lies about my selfishness and lack of maternal instinct, had made the exact same choice I'd made, except her reasons were about convenience and timing, while mine had been about mercy and love. "How do you know this?" I asked Carmen, my voice barely steady as the implications crashed over me. Carmen's eyes filled with tears as she explained that Patricia had confessed the truth during a moment of drunken grief at her husband Carlos's funeral 5 years earlier, swearing Carmen to secrecy but clearly still tormented by guilt and shame after 4 decades of hiding. She told me she'd never forgiven herself. Carmen continued, her voice breaking. She said that every time she looked at Miguel, she thought about the child she'd chosen not to have. She became obsessed with being the perfect Catholic mother to make up for what she saw as her original sin. When Carlos died, she started going to confession weekly, sometimes daily, but she could never bring herself to confess the abortion because she was terrified of the judgment. Carmen explained how Patricia's guilt had gradually transformed into a rigid moral stance against abortion under any circumstances, as if condemning other women could somehow absolve her of her own choice. She'd become a zealot for the very cause she'd once defied, desperate to prove her worthiness through moral superiority. But why me specifically? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the psychological mechanisms at work. Carmen explained that my medical knowledge, my professional competence, and my apparent composure during the crisis had triggered something in Patricia. She kept saying that you were too smart to have had no choice, that someone with your medical background could have found alternatives. In her mind, you had resources and knowledge that she'd lacked at 19, which made your choice less forgivable than hers had been. The twisted logic was becoming clear. Patricia needed to believe that my situation was different from hers, that my choice was less justifiable, because admitting our circumstances were comparable would force her to confront her own unresolved guilt. Carmen reached across the table and took my hands, her touch anchoring me as the full scope of Patricia's psychological warfare became clear. Chloe, she's not just trying to destroy your reputation, she's trying to atone for her own choices by sacrificing you. In her mind, if she can punish you for making a similar decision, maybe God will forgive her for making it first. The religious component explained so much. Patricia's sudden increase in church attendance after our loss, her public displays of moral outrage, her positioning herself as the righteous grandmother wronged by a selfish daughter-in-law. She wasn't mourning Diego. She was using his death as an opportunity to perform penance for her own secret sin. Is there any proof? I asked, knowing that Carmen's word alone wouldn't be enough to expose Patricia's hypocrisy. Carmen hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed me old text messages from Patricia sent during particularly difficult nights over the past 5 years. Messages where Patricia had alluded to mistakes from my youth and choices I can never undo and sins that follow you forever. While not explicit, the messages created a pattern of guilt and regret that supported Carmen's story. But Carmen had something else. She knew where Patricia kept her most private documents, including what she suspected were medical records from 1979 that Patricia had never been able to bring herself to destroy. She keeps everything in a locked box in her bedroom closet, Carmen explained. Old letters, photographs, documents she doesn't want anyone to see. I've watched her hide things there for years, and I think the proof of what happened in 1979 is in that box. But Chloe, getting access to it would require... She trailed off, both of us understanding what she was suggesting. Breaking into Patricia's home to find evidence felt extreme, but so was watching my marriage disintegrate under the weight of her lies. I thought about Miguel's growing distance, about the community that had turned against me, about the career I loved becoming tainted by whispered accusations. Sometimes, desperate times required desperate measures. We spent the next hour planning carefully. Carmen still had a key to Patricia's house from when she'd helped care for Carlos during his final illness, and she knew Patricia's schedule well enough to predict when the house would be empty. Patricia attended Tuesday evening Bible study religiously, leaving at 6:30 and not returning until after 9. That would give us nearly 3 hours to search for evidence without risking discovery. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Carmen asked as we prepared to leave the cafe. I thought about my destroyed reputation, my failing marriage, and the innocent baby whose memory was being twisted into a weapon against me. "Patricia declared war on my life," I replied. "It's time I fought back." The following Tuesday evening, I parked 2 blocks away from Patricia's house and waited for Carmen's text confirming that Patricia had left for Bible study. My heart was pounding as I walked through the familiar neighborhood where I'd spent so many family gatherings, past houses where I'd once been welcomed and was now whispered about. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Patricia sat in church studying scripture about love and forgiveness, I was preparing to invade her privacy to expose her hypocrisy. But sometimes justice requires us to venture into morally gray areas, especially when the alternative is allowing lies to triumph over truth. Carmen let me into Patricia's house through the back door, and we moved quickly but carefully toward the bedroom where decades of secrets waited to be uncovered. The house felt different now, not like the welcoming family home where I'd shared countless dinners and celebrations, but like the lair of someone who'd been systematically destroying my life. Patricia's bedroom was neat and austere, dominated by a large crucifix on the wall and photographs of Miguel at various ages. The locked box Carmen had described was exactly where she'd said it would be, hidden behind winter coats in the closet. My hands were shaking as Carmen used the key she'd seen Patricia hide years earlier, both of us knowing that what we found inside would either vindicate me or prove that I'd become paranoid and desperate. The contents of the box were like archaeological layers of Patricia's hidden life. Birth certificates, old photographs, letters from family in Mexico, and underneath it all, a manila envelope marked 1979, private, in Patricia's careful handwriting. Inside that envelope was proof beyond any doubt of Carmen's story. Medical records from a women's health clinic in downtown Chicago, receipts for services rendered, post-procedure care instructions, and most damning of all, a journal entry written in Patricia's own hand 3 days after her abortion. March 18, 1979, it began. "It's done. I made the choice that was right for me, even if I can never tell anyone about it. I'm not ready to be a mother. I have plans, dreams, a future I want to build first. Maybe someday I'll regret this, but right now, I only feel relief." The journal entry continued for several pages, detailing Patricia's thoughts and feelings in the weeks following her abortion. She wrote about her relief at solving the problem, her plans to finish community college and travel before settling down, her conviction that she'd made the mature, responsible choice. There was no shame, no guilt, no religious anguish, just a young woman confident in her decision to prioritize her own future over an unplanned pregnancy. The contrast with her current moral crusade was staggering, but what made my blood run cold was a later entry dated 6 months afterward. "Carlos proposed tonight. He has no idea what I did, and he never will. I'll be the perfect wife and mother when the time is right. This secret dies with me." As I photographed every document with trembling hands, I discovered something even more revealing. A letter Patricia had written but never sent to the clinic, thanking them for their compassionate care during a difficult time and praising their non-judgmental approach to women's reproductive choices. The letter was dated 2 weeks after her abortion and was signed, gratefully, Patricia Morales, her maiden name. She'd not only had an abortion, she'd been grateful for it and supportive of reproductive rights. The woman now crusading against my choice had once been an advocate for exactly the kind of medical care she was condemning me for seeking. But the most devastating discovery was a series of newspaper clippings from the 1980s that Patricia had saved, articles about reproductive rights and women's health issues. Several were opinion pieces supporting access to abortion services, and one was a letter to the editor signed with Patricia's name defending a woman's right to make private medical decisions without community judgment. The hypocrisy was so complete, so absolute, that it took my breath away. This wasn't just about secret guilt. This was about a woman who'd completely transformed her identity, creating a false persona built on condemning the very choices she'd once celebrated. She wasn't projecting guilt. She was projecting an entirely fabricated version of herself. Carmen helped me document everything, ensuring we could prove not just that Patricia had had an abortion, but that she'd been proud of her choice at the time and supportive of other women's rights to make similar decisions. As we carefully returned everything to its original place, I felt a complex mixture of triumph and sadness. I had the evidence I needed to expose Patricia's lies and clear my name, but I also had insight into the psychological prison she'd built for herself over 4 decades. The young woman who'd confidently written about her reproductive choices had become a bitter, fearful person so consumed by manufactured shame that she was willing to destroy innocent people to maintain her false identity. The plan for Thanksgiving was simple and devastating. Patricia had been hosting the family dinner for over 20 years, and this year would be no different despite the tension surrounding Miguel and me. The entire extended family would be there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. The same community that had been poisoned against me by Patricia's lies. I spent the week before Thanksgiving preparing my presentation carefully, organizing the evidence in a way that would tell the complete story of Patricia's deception and hypocrisy. Carmen had agreed to attend and support my revelations with her own testimony about Patricia's confession, providing an independent witness to corroborate the evidence. Miguel had grown even more distant in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, barely speaking to me except when absolutely necessary. The man who'd once shared everything with me now treated me like a stranger who'd betrayed his trust. When I tried to hint that I had important information about his mother, he shut me down immediately, saying he couldn't handle any more drama and just wanted to get through the holiday. I realized that our marriage wouldn't survive another week of Patricia's manipulation, but I also knew that Thursday would either restore our relationship or end it permanently. There was no middle ground left. The truth would set us free or destroy us completely. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what would either be vindication or total social destruction. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that projected both respect and authority, the kind of outfit I wore when delivering difficult news to families at the hospital. The folder of evidence went into my purse, along with printed copies for every adult family member. As I looked at myself in the mirror one last time, I thought about Diego, the innocent baby whose memory had been twisted into a weapon against me. Today, your mama sets the record straight, mijo, I whispered to his photograph on our dresser. Today, the truth finally comes out. The family gathering was exactly what I'd expected. About 30 people crowded into Patricia's living and dining rooms, the smell of turkey and tamales filling the air, children running around while adults caught up on gossip and family news. The conversations didn't stop when Miguel and I arrived, but they definitely shifted. I could feel eyes tracking my movements, could hear the undertone of whispered comments about my presence. Patricia greeted us with performative warmth, kissing my cheek and asking loudly how I was holding up, in a tone calculated to remind everyone of my supposed moral failings. She was playing her role perfectly, the loving grandmother-in-law showing Christian forgiveness to the woman who'd murdered her grandchild. As we gathered around the extended table for the traditional pre-meal prayer, I felt my heart racing with anticipation and terror. Patricia stood at the head of the table, hands clasped and eyes closed, preparing to lead the family in giving thanks for their many blessings. She began the familiar words about gratitude and family, but I was no longer listening. I was thinking about Diego, about the lies that had destroyed my reputation, about the marriage that was hanging by a thread because of one woman's need to hide her own past. When Patricia reached the part about being grateful for the precious gift of life and the blessing of children, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Actually, Patricia, I said, standing slowly, my voice cutting through the holy silence like a blade, before we give thanks, I think there's something this family needs to know about the precious gift of life and the choices we make about children. Every head turned toward me, confusion and alarm spreading across faces as people tried to understand what was happening. Patricia's eyes snapped open, and I saw immediate panic there. She knew this moment had been coming. even if she didn't know exactly what I'd discovered. Miguel grabbed my arm, hissing, "Chloe, don't do this." But I was already reaching into my purse, already pulling out the folder that would change everything. The truth had been buried for 44 years. But today, at Patricia's own table, surrounded by the family she'd manipulated with lies, it was finally going to see the light. For months, Patricia has been telling everyone that I deliberately killed my baby because I wasn't ready to be a mother, I announced, distributing copies of documents around the stunned table. These are my medical records from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, proving that our son Diego had an encephaly, a fatal condition where the brain and skull don't develop. Miguel and I made the heartbreaking choice to end Diego's suffering before it began, not because we didn't want him, but because we loved him too much to watch him die in agony. The silence was absolute as family members examined the medical documentation, seeing the devastating reality of our loss laid out in clinical detail that was impossible to dispute or misinterpret. But I wasn't finished. However, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, your beloved Patricia is not exactly in a position to judge anyone for the choices they make about pregnancy. I distributed the second set of documents, copies of Patricia's 1979 medical records, her grateful letter to the clinic, her journal entries celebrating her choice, her newspaper clippings supporting reproductive rights. In March 1979, Patricia Herrera had an abortion because she wasn't ready to be a mother and wanted to finish college first. She was 19, unmarried, pregnant with a healthy baby, and she chose to terminate the pregnancy for convenience. Not only did she make this choice, but she was proud of it, grateful for it, and even publicly defended other women's rights to make similar choices. The explosion that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in a family setting. Patricia's face cycled through white shock, red rage, and pale terror as she tried to deny everything while family members passed around undeniable evidence of her 44-year deception. Carmen stood up to confirm the story, explaining how Patricia had confessed years earlier and revealing the psychological torment that had driven her to project her guilt onto me. Miguel stared at the documents in his hands as if they were written in an alien language, slowly processing that his mother had not only hidden a massive secret, but had deliberately destroyed his marriage to protect her false image. "This was different," Patricia finally screamed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "I was young and stupid. I made a mistake." But Chloe knew what she was doing. She chose to kill a baby she could have saved. Her desperation was obvious, her logic collapsing under the weight of medical evidence and her own documented history. The woman who'd spent months painting me as a cold, calculating killer was revealing herself to be exactly what she'd accused me of being, someone who'd made a choice about pregnancy and then lied about it for decades. Miguel finally spoke, his voice broken and filled with disbelief. "Mom, how could you do this to us? How could you destroy my marriage to hide your own secret?" The dinner ended with Patricia locked in her bedroom, most of the family leaving in shock and disgust, and Miguel sitting at the devastated table with tears streaming down his face as he finally understood what his mother had done to our marriage. "Chloe, I'm so sorry," he whispered, reaching for my hand for the first time in months. "I'm so sorry I believed her. I'm so sorry I doubted you. I'm so sorry I let her poison me against the woman I love." It was the beginning of a long conversation about trust, manipulation, and the work it would take to rebuild what Patricia had nearly destroyed. The truth had finally set us free, but freedom, I learned, was just the beginning of healing. Justice, it turned out, was a dish best served with a side of undeniable evidence and a family willing to face the truth about themselves. Did Chloe's revenge blow your mind? Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. We read every single one and love hearing from you. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss these incredible stories, and click that next video that's already waiting for you on your screen. See you there.